Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why some people bounce back from tough times while others struggle? Today we're diving into a fascinating study about coping with really stressful jobs, specifically for railway personnel, and what makes them strong. Imagine working on the railways. It is a job that comes with a lot of potential for really difficult, even traumatic experiences. Think about accidents, critical incidents, or even dangerous situations they might encounter. You'd expect a lot of people in these jobs to develop stress-related problems, right? But most don't. So, what is going on? This study wanted to figure out if a person's ability to be flexible with their coping strategies makes a difference, beyond just how much stress they've been exposed to or what support systems they have. Now, the researchers are really interested in something called the regulatory flexibility framework. This isn't about being rigid, it is about being adaptable. It suggests that successful coping isn't about always using the same strategy, but about being able to switch between different ways of handling stress depending on what the situation needs. For railway workers, this could mean being able to stay calm and focus during an emergency, and then later being able to process what happened. So they asked, does this flexibility in coping actually predict whether someone develops PTSD symptoms even after we consider how much trauma they've experienced and the resources they have, like social support? And they wanted to see if this flexibility idea is better at predicting symptoms than just looking at two separate coping styles. Forward. Focused coping, which is about staying goal-oriented and moving forward, kind of like putting on a brave face and focusing on the task, and trauma. Focused coping, which is about reflecting on and processing the traumatic experience. To find out, they gathered a group of 444 railway workers. These folks had all experienced some pretty serious incidents related to their jobs. They filled out a bunch of questionnaires. They talked about the trauma they'd faced, both on and off the job, and how distressed they felt during those events. They also reported on their social support from friends, family, supervisors, and colleagues, and what kind of support their workplace offered. And importantly, they answered questions about how they coped with difficult experiences, looking at their ability to be flexible, forward, focused, or trauma-focused in their coping. The main things they measured as outcomes were symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, and also symptoms of depression. They wanted to see if the coping styles predicted these symptoms. Now, let's get to what they found. The results showed that how people coped with trauma did explain important extra information about their PTSD symptoms, even after they accounted for how much trauma they'd experienced and their resources. This suggests that coping strategies are really important, not just the bad stuff that happens to you or the good support you have. But here is where it gets really interesting. When they compared different models, they found that just focusing on forward-focused coping, that idea of staying goal-oriented and moving on, was actually a stronger predictor of fewer PTSD symptoms than the overall flexibility score. So, that ability to switch between coping styles wasn't as powerful as simply being good at pushing forward. In fact, when they looked at all the things they measured, the strongest predictor of lower PTSD symptoms was this forward-focused coping. The more people felt they could handle moving forward and stay goal-directed, the fewer PTSD symptoms they reported. And here is a curveball they didn't expect. They found that trauma-focused coping, that style of reflecting and processing the trauma, was actually linked to more PTSD symptoms, not less. This is quite different from some older theories that suggest fully processing trauma is always the key. The researchers suggest that maybe in a job like a railway worker, where the trauma might be indirect or involve witnessing events, deep processing might actually lead to more rumination, which isn't helpful. They also looked at depressive symptoms, and they found a very similar pattern. Forward-focused coping was again the strongest predictor of fewer depressive symptoms, and trauma-focused coping was linked to more depressive symptoms. So what does all this mean? The study really emphasizes how important our coping strategies are for our mental health, especially in tough jobs. While the idea of being flexible in your coping is still valuable, this research suggests that for railway workers facing occupational trauma, the ability to focus on moving forward and maintaining goals might be particularly protective. It seems that while flexibility is good, simply being good at forward-focused coping is a really strong predictor of psychological well-being after experiencing work. Related trauma, it's like saying yes, knowing how to switch gears is useful, but being really good at the forward gear is especially important here. Now, the study used a few established tools to measure things. For PTSD symptoms, they use the Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Checklist, or PCL-5. Think of this as a detailed questionnaire that asks about specific symptoms you might experience after a traumatic event over the past month. The higher your score, the more severe your PTSD symptoms are. In this study, they found it had excellent internal consistency, meaning the questions within the scale tended to measure the same thing reliably. For depressive symptoms, they used the Patient Health Questionnaire -9 or PHQ -9. This is a shorter, widely used questionnaire that asks about 9 common symptoms of depression over the past 2 weeks. Again, higher scores mean more severe depressive symptoms. This measure also showed high internal consistency in their sample. The key measure for coping strategies was the Perceived Ability to Cope with Trauma Scale, or PACT. This scale is designed to capture how you feel you can deal with trauma. It breaks down into 2 main parts: forward-focused coping and trauma-focused coping. The scale uses a 7-point rating system, so participants are indicating how strongly they feel they possess these abilities. The researchers found good internal consistency for both the forward-focused and trauma-focused subscales. In their main statistical analysis, they used PTSD symptoms as the outcome they wanted to explain. They started by adding in demographic information like whether someone was a train driver, their age, and sex. Then they added in measures of trauma exposure, things like how many critical incidents they'd experienced and how distressed they felt. After that, they added social support from different sources. They also included measures related to organizational support and barriers like self-stigma of seeking help. After all those factors were in, they added in the PACT flexibility score, that overall measure of how flexible people felt they were. This flexibility score did explain an additional 6.4% of the variance in PTSD symptoms, which is significant, but then they compared it. They then tested a different model where instead of the flexibility score, they included the separate scores for forward-focused coping and trauma. Focused coping, this model explained a much larger chunk of additional variance, 14.1%. This tells us that the individual coping strategies were better at explaining PTSD symptoms than the overarching flexibility measure. Specifically, in this better-fitting model, forward-focused coping was a strong predictor of fewer PTSD symptoms with a standardized coefficient of -0.46. On the other hand, trauma-focused coping was a predictor of more PTSD symptoms with a coefficient of +0.11. This confirms their hypothesis that the individual styles matter more, and in a surprising way for trauma-focused coping. It is important to remember that this study was cross-sectional. This means they collected all the data at one point in time. So while they found strong associations, they can't definitively say that coping strategies cause PTSD symptoms. It is possible that people with more PTSD symptoms might naturally adopt certain coping styles. Future research would need to follow people over time to establish causation. Another point is that the study participants were railway workers. And while they had experienced critical incidents, they weren't necessarily diagnosed with PTSD or depression. The study authors mentioned that the findings might be generalizable to the broader population. But it would be valuable to see if these patterns hold true for individuals who are already experiencing clinical levels of PTSD. So, to wrap it all up, this research offers some compelling insights. It shows that how you cope with trauma is a really significant factor, perhaps even more so than the amount of trauma or your support system, in predicting your mental health after difficult events at work. And while we often hear about the importance of processing difficult emotions, this study suggests that for those in high-risk occupations like railway work, actively focusing on moving forward and staying goal-oriented might be a key to protecting your mental well-being. It challenges some traditional ideas and points us toward practical strategies. What I find particularly interesting is the strong showing of forward-focused coping. It really highlights the power of a proactive, forward-looking mindset, especially when facing adversity. It's a reminder that sometimes focusing on what you can control and where you are going can be incredibly beneficial. It would be fascinating to see future studies explore interventions aimed at boosting this specific type of coping in high-stress professions. What do you think about these findings? Does the idea of forward-focused coping resonate with you? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this breakdown, please give this video a like. Subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science explained simply, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next mental health deep dive. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.